February 18th, 2001, 8 p.m, Foxstone Park, Vienna, Virginia. The temperature is hovering just above freezing. The park, 14 acres of woodland along Wolf Trap Creek, is empty, it's dark, it's silent, and a thin layer of snow clings to the ground. The only light comes from the amber glow of a street lamp near the entrance, where a brown and yellow park sign stands watch over the trailhead. A silver Ford Taurus pulls into the lot. The driver doesn't exit immediately. He sits for a moment, scanning the tree line, the shadows, the silence. He's done this a dozen times before. This exact ritual at parks just like this one. But tonight feels different, and he just can't explain why. The man who steps out of the car is tall, he's thin, with stooped shoulders that curve forwards as he's trying to minimize his own presence. 56 years old, pale complexion, black hair, swept back, dark, inexpensive suit. He always wears dark suits, has worn them for so long his colleagues call him Dr. Death behind his back. He moves with the cautious gait of someone who has spent a lifetime avoiding attention. He walks to the park entrance sign and reaches into his pocket, produces a strip of white medical tape, Johnson & Johnson brand, the same kind you'd find in any household first aid kit. He presses it vertically against the wooden sign, a simple signal, ancient tradecraft. It means, I am ready. The package is coming. When he walks down the wooden path towards the rustic footbridge that spans the creek, he moves carefully, deliberately, a man who has rehearsed this choreography for over 2 decades. At the bridge, he crouches, pulls out a sealed garbage bag, hefty brand, black plastic, and tapes it securely to the underside of the wooden slats. Inside that bag, classified documents, top secret, some of them beyond top secret, the kind of material that doesn't even officially exist. He stands, brushes off his knees, and begins to walk back towards his car. He doesn't make it. They come out of the darkness. FBI agents, a full arrest team, SWAT members with weapons drawn. They have been watching. They have been watching for weeks, and now, finally, they have what they need. He doesn't run, doesn't resist. He simply looks at the agents surrounding him, agents from his own bureau, men and women who might have passed him in the hallways at headquarters, and asks a simple question. What took you so long? It's the question of a narcissist, the question of a man who has evaded detection for 22 years and always believed, on some level, that he was just too smart to get caught. It's also the question of a man who perhaps wanted to be caught, who had been playing Russian roulette with his own life and his country's secrets for so long that the bullet finally finding the chamber felt almost like relief. His name is Robert Philip Hansen, FBI Special Agent, counterintelligence expert, devout Catholic, father of 6, and, as the Department of Justice would later conclude, responsible for possibly the worst intelligence disaster in US history. For more than 2 decades, this man, this family man, this churchgoer, this FBI agent sworn to protect his country, had been selling America's most closely guarded secrets to the Soviet Union and then to Russia. He betrayed human sources who were executed. He compromised billion-dollar intelligence programs. He revealed nuclear war survival plans. He sold the location of a secret tunnel beneath the Soviet embassy. And he did it all while attending daily mass, lecturing colleagues about the evils of godless communism and raising 6 children in suburban Virginia. But the secrets Robert Hansen kept weren't limited to espionage. Because behind the mask of the devout Catholic father, behind the dour FBI agent hunting Russian spies, lived another man entirely, a man who secretly filmed himself having sex with his wife and invited his best friend to watch. A man who posted explicit stories about his marriage on internet chat rooms using his real name. A man who spent $80,000 on a stripper while his children attended private Catholic schools. A man whose compartmentalized life was so extreme that the psychiatrist who spent 100 hours interviewing him afterward called him the most compartmentalized person I have ever met. This is the story of Robert Hansen, and to understand what he became, we have to start with what made him, which means we have to start with his father. Part 1. The making of a monster. A father's cruelty. Robert Philip Hansen was born on April 18, 1944 in Chicago's Norwood Park neighborhood. An only child, his mother Vivian was a housewife. His father Howard was a Chicago police officer who would serve nearly 30 years on the force, eventually rising to lieutenant before transferring to the intelligence unit file room. Howard Hansen was also, by all accounts, an emotional sadist who spent his son's entire childhood systematically breaking him down. Years later, when psychiatrist Dr. David Charney sat down with Robert Hansen for the first of nearly 100 hours of post-arrest interviews, he asked Hansen to tell him about himself. The very first story Hansen chose to share, the one that came to mind before any other, was about being rolled up inside a carpet as punishment. Yeah, mull that one over for a moment. Out of every memory from childhood, every formative experience, that was the one Robert Hansen wanted his psychiatrist to hear first. The image of a small boy wrapped in heavy fabric, unable to move, struggling to breathe, while his father looked on. But that was just the beginning. When Robert was old enough to get his driver's license, Howard decided his son was a bit cocky and needed to be brought down, so he paid off the driving instructor to fail Robert on the exam. His own mother, Vivian, later acknowledged this. That was terrible, she admitted. But she never intervened. She never said a word. When Robert went away to Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, 195 miles from Chicago, his father drove all that way specifically to disparage him to his professors. He urged school officials not to put Robert on the dean's list because it would go to Bob's head. Wedding day. The moment when most fathers feel pride, when they embrace the next chapter of their son's life. Howard Hansen approached the bride, a beautiful young Catholic woman named Bernadette Wauck, known as Bonnie, and he said, "Why do you want to marry this guy? You're marrying a loser." On his son's wedding day. A relative who knew the family described Howard bluntly. Howard was mentally abusive. The guy was weird. He wanted to thwart Bob from succeeding. Young Robert responded to this relentless cruelty the only way he knew how. He withdrew. He became a ghost. Classmates from his school years remembered him as someone in the woodwork. You just didn't notice him. A skinny boy with pale skin, narrow shoulders that curved forward, and eyes that gazed off somewhere away from the camera. His isolation deepened when in 6th grade his best friend Paul Steinbacher collapsed and died right in front of him. Robert heard a crash from the bathroom and found his only close friend lying dead on the floor. It was an era when therapists didn't rush into schools to help children process trauma. The death was announced sadly to Robert's class the next day, and then nothing. No counselling, no support, just another wound to carry alone. Robert retreated further into himself. He spent hours alone in the basement teaching himself ham radio, secretly hooking up an unauthorized telephone line, learning to hide, learning to create secret worlds that only he could access. And somewhere in those lonely years, he discovered a book that would change his life. The autobiography of Kim Philby, the legendary British double agent who had spied for the Soviet Union for decades while rising to the highest levels of MI6. Philby was brilliant, charming, invisible. He fooled everyone. Years later, in a letter to his Russian handlers, Hansen wrote something extraordinary. "I decided on this course when I was 14 years old. I read Philby's book. Now that is insane, eh?" At 14, the seed was planted. The boy whose father called him a loser had found a new identity. The invisible man, smarter than everyone, living a secret life that no one could see. The wandering years. Hansen graduated from Taft High School in 1962 with a yearbook quote that read, "Science is the light of life." He enrolled at Knox College, majoring in chemistry while excelling at Russian language electives. Courses added after Sputnik sparked American paranoia about Soviet capabilities. He was academically inconsistent. Once walked out of a Western Civilization final because he didn't like the questions. Yet he devoured physics textbooks as though they were novels. A professor later asked about him had nothing to say. After Knox, he applied to the National Security Agency as a cryptographer. Rejected. Budget constraints. His mother pushed him towards dentistry, so he enrolled at Northwestern University Dental School. But as a dorm mate later observed, it was a career Bob didn't really want. He later said he didn't like spit all that much. Fair. He abandoned dentistry and pivoted to an MBA in accounting and information systems, becoming a certified public accountant by 1971. Then, 3 months after his father retired from the Chicago police, Robert joined the same department, but not as a beat cop. He was accepted into the elite C5 unit, an internal affairs squad that investigated corrupt officers. Only 30 were accepted from thousands of applicants. The work involved spying on fellow cops. Deputy Superintendent Mitchell Ware remembered Hanson's interview. Very calm, very cool, very collected. He really wanted to clean up corruption. Or maybe he just wanted to learn how to catch people, how to surveil them, how to be the one holding the secrets. But Chicago wasn't big enough for Robert Hanson's ambitions. So on January 12, 1976, he was sworn in as a special agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, swearing to bear true faith and allegiance to the United States of America. 3 years later, he would begin systematically betraying that oath in ways that would get people killed. Dr. Death. Hanson's first posting was Gary, Indiana, a backwater with limited counterintelligence opportunities. But in 1978, he transferred to the New York field office, and within 6 months had maneuvered his way into Soviet counterintelligence. This was the big leagues, the cold heart of the Cold War. Almost immediately, a red flag emerged that should have ended his career. While still assigned to the criminal squad, Hanson spent hours reading closed Soviet espionage files he had no conceivable need to know, files that contained the identities of the FBI's most significant Soviet sources. Nobody questioned it, nobody stopped him. His colleagues gave him nicknames: Dr. Death, the Mortician, the Undertaker, all earned through his trademark black suits, pale complexion, dour demeanor, and aloof personality. The Office of Inspector General would later document that he had poor interpersonal skills, was an awkward and uncommunicative loner, and conveyed a sense of intellectual superiority that alienated many of his co-workers. One supervisor called him the strangest person he had ever worked with. Yet Hanson possessed unusual technical abilities. He developed a case prioritization system still in use at the FBI today. He demonstrated rare aptitudes with computers at the time, when such skills were exceptional. He was, as colleagues acknowledged, smart, technically proficient, and analytical. He also knew it, and that was the problem, because Robert Hanson saw himself as James Bond. Brilliant, suave, dangerous. The FBI saw him as a librarian. Dr. David Charney, the psychiatrist who would later interview him extensively, described the gap between those perceptions. He was not a guy that fit into the culture of the other special agents. He was stiff and morbid looking. Some people called him the Undertaker. He wore black suits. And when someone feels like a failure internally when their father has spent decades telling them they're a loser, and now their employer seems to agree, there are many ways to manage that rage. Robert Hanson found his. Part 2. First Betrayal. Walking through the door. November 1979, New York City. Robert Hanson had been an FBI agent for less than 4 years. He's 35 years old, with a growing family, 3 children already, more to come. Bonnie stays home with the kids. They tithe to Opus Dei, the conservative Catholic organization. The children will go to private Catholic schools. On an FBI salary, money is always tight. And yet money alone doesn't explain what happens next. Hansen walks into the offices of Amtorg Trading Corporation, a known Soviet GRU military intelligence front operation in Manhattan. He carries an anonymous package. He doesn't reveal his name. He doesn't reveal his employer. He simply offers information. The identities of FBI human sources, details of FBI bugging operations, and most devastatingly, the name of General Dmitry Polyakov, codenamed Top Hat, the CIA's single most valuable Soviet asset for over 2 decades. With that one act, Robert Hansen crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. He became a traitor. Later, when investigators asked why, he said his only motivation was financial. But that's not the whole truth, because in another letter, years later, he would admit he's been thinking about this since he was 14, since he read Kim Philby's autobiography and dreamed of becoming the Invisible Man, the one who fooled everyone. The one who was smarter than the whole world. The GRU paid him approximately $20,000 to $30,000 during his first cycle. Hansen communicated through one-time pad cipher systems and encoded radio transmissions. He collected his payments at dead drops around New York. The game had begun. The priest's terrible counsel. Spring 1980, the Hansen home in Scarsdale, New York. Bonnie Hansen comes down to the basement and catches her husband in the act, scurrying to cover up some papers, as she would later describe it at least. She sees a strange letter, something that doesn't make sense, something from the Soviets. Around the same time, her sister Jean Beglis visits the Hansen home and notices something else. A pile of cash sitting on a dresser. $20,000 or more. An impossible sum for an FBI agent's family. Bonnie confronts Robert, and here's where the mask goes on, where we see the first glimpse of Hansen's extraordinary ability to compartmentalize, to lie, to manipulate. He minimizes everything. He was just tricking the Russians, he says, feeding them some false information to extract money. Nobody was hurt. It was practically patriotic, when you think about it. This was, of course, a complete lie, but Bonnie, pregnant with their 4th child, devoted to her husband, deeply religious, wanted to believe him. She demanded that they consult their priest. So they drove to New Rochelle to meet Father Robert P. Bucarelli, an Opie Day priest. At first, Bucarelli told Hansen what any reasonable person would say. He should turn himself in. The next day, the priest changed his advice. According to Hansen, Bucarelli said he could receive absolution if he promised never to spy again and donated the money to charity. That was it. No turning himself in. No facing the legal consequences. No informing the government that a counterintelligence agent had been compromised. Just pray, give the money to Mother Teresa's Little Sisters of the Poor, and sin no more. Hansen agreed. He claimed he donated approximately $20,000 in small increments. And then he went back to work at the FBI, with access to America's most sensitive secrets, and nobody ever knew. That confession, that absolution obtained without consequences, would haunt America's intelligence for another 21 years. Because Robert Hansen had learned something important. He could get caught. He could confess. And he could just walk away. The rules apparently didn't apply to him. The return. For 4 years, Robert Hansen stayed dormant. He moved to FBI headquarters in Washington, relocated his family to Vienna, Virginia, and continued his career in counterintelligence. Bonnie believed that the nightmare was over. It wasn't. On October 1st, 1985, Hansen mailed a letter from Prince George's County, Maryland. The outer envelope was addressed to Victor M. Degtier, a KGB officer living in Alexandria, Virginia. Inside was another envelope marked, "Do not open. Take this envelope unopened to Victor I. Cherkashin." Cherkashin was the KGB's counterintelligence chief in Washington, one of the most senior Soviet intelligence officers in America. Hansen knew exactly who to contact. The letter, later recovered by the FBI, remains one of the most chilling documents in American espionage history. Dear Mr. Cherkashin, soon I will send a box of documents to Mr. Degtier. They are from certain of the most sensitive and highly compartmented projects of the US intelligence community. All are originals to aid in verifying their authenticity. I must warn of certain risks to my security of which you may not be aware. I warn that Mr. Boris Yushin, line PR SF, Mr. Sergei Motorin, line PR Wash, and Mr. Valery Martynov, line X Walsh, have been recruited by our special services. With this single letter, Hansen identified 3 KGB officers who were secretly working for the United States. He signed their death warrants as casually as he might sign a birthday card. Why did he switch from GRU to the KGB? He explained it later with the cold logic of a businessman. The KGB was more professional, had a longer term outlook, and paid more money. The second chapter of his betrayal had begun. It would last 16 more years. Part 3. The Human Toll. The Jewel in the Crown. Before we go further into Hansen's story, we need to understand what his betrayal actually cost. Not in dollars, though the damage reached into the hundreds of billions, but in lives. General Dmitry Polyakov, codenamed Top Hat by the FBI, Bourbon by the CIA. Born July 6, 1921 in Soviet Ukraine. Rose through the GRU ranks to Major General, while secretly providing intelligence to the United States for 25 years. Former CIA Director James Wolseley called him the jewel in the crown, adding, "What General Polyakov did for us in the West didn't just help us win the Cold War, it kept the war from becoming hot." So what turned Polyakov into a spy? Well, his infant son was dying, suffering from either polio or a heart condition. Accounts somewhat differ, and needed surgery that was available only in the West. Polyakov requested permission to have the operation performed in New York. Soviet leadership refused. The child died. Polyakov never forgave the system. Unlike most spies, Polyakov refused significant payment. He accepted only about $3,000 per month, mostly in Black & Decker power tools, fishing gear, and work overalls. CIA officer Gene Verdefuller remembered, "He didn't do this for money. He insisted on staying in place to help us." Hansen first betrayed Polyakov to the GRU in 1979. The Soviets didn't act immediately, perhaps skeptical of an anonymous source. Then in 1985, CIA officer Aldrich Ames independently betrayed Polyakov, confirming the earlier intelligence. Polyakov was arrested in 1986. On March 15, 1988, he was executed, shot in the back of the head in the traditional Soviet manner called Vysshaya Mera, the highest measure of punishment. No one knows where Dmitry Polyakov is buried. The young officer Valery Martynov, KGB Lieutenant Colonel, 41 years old, arrived in Washington in November 1980 as a third secretary to the Soviet embassy, a cover for his intelligence work. He and his wife Natalia fell in love with America. "Those were the best years of my life," she would later say. Recruited by the FBI and CIA in 1982, Martynov was betrayed by Aldrich Ames in June 1985 and independently confirmed by Hansen that October. The KGB now knew beyond doubt Martynov was a traitor to the motherland. KGB counterintelligence chief Viktor Cherkashin, the same man Hansen had written to, needed a ruse to get Martynov back to Moscow. He told the unsuspecting agent that he'd been selected for an honor guard escorting the high-profile defector Vitaly Yurchenko home. On November 6, 1985, Martynov left his family, without any apparent worries, donning his fur hat and giving Natalia a jaunty wave. He told his wife he'd return shortly. The moment his plane landed in Moscow, he was arrested. Natalia was brought to Lefortovo prison for interrogation. Over the next 2 years, she was allowed to see her husband 4 times. Each time he looked older and more despairing. Valery Martynov was executed on May 28, 1987. Natalia only learned of her husband's death 9 days later. The authorities had misaddressed the notice. Her haunting words to Washington Post in 1994. "If he did not work for America, why was he shot?" The vulnerable one. Sergei Motorin, KGB major, recruited not through ideology but through his own vulnerabilities. The FBI learned that Motorin had been in a car accident with a prostitute and had tried to barter his official vodka allocation for stereo equipment. Minor violations by Western standards, but career-ending disasters under Soviet rule. Under pressure, he agreed to spy. His most significant contribution: identifying every KGB agent in the Soviet embassy in Washington. Betrayed by both Ames and Hansen in 1985, Motorin was arrested and executed in February 1987, shot in the back of the head. 3 men, 3 bullets, 3 bodies in unmarked graves somewhere in Russia. All because Robert Hansen wanted to prove he was smarter than everyone else. Part 4. The Secret Life. The Tradecraft of a Careful Traitor. What made Robert Hansen uniquely dangerous, what allowed him to evade detection for over 2 decades while Aldrich Ames was caught after just 9 years, was his discipline. Ames was sloppy. He met his handlers in person. He purchased a $540,000 house in cash and drove a Jaguar on a $70,000 salary. He failed polygraphs repeatedly, but somehow no one investigated his lifestyle. Hansen? He never met his handlers in person, not once in 22 years. He explained his philosophy in a letter to his Russian contacts. "I am much safer if you know little about me." And later, "Meeting in this country is not really that hard to manage, but I am loath to do so, not because it's risky, but because it involves revealing my identity. That insulation has been my best protection against betrayal by someone like me, working from whatever motivation." His operational security was meticulous. He used multiple code names: B, Ramon, Roman Garcia, Jim Baker, G. Robertson. He employed date codes, adding 6 to all stated months, days, and times, so that September 9th actually meant March 3rd. He placed white medical tape on park signs as signals. Vertical meant "I'm ready," horizontal meant "the drop is loaded." All his dead drop sites were within minutes of his Virginia home, under footbridges at Nottoway Park, Foxstone Park, Idlewood Park, Eakin Community Park. He knew every trail, every shadow, every sightline. He passed 26 encrypted computer diskettes to the KGB using a specialized 40-track formatting mode. He regularly searched the FBI's own databases for his own name, his address, and the phrase "dead drop." He refused to travel abroad to meet his handlers. He rejected any specialized tradecraft equipment. He controlled every variable he could control. And what did all this discipline earn him? Over 22 years, approximately $600,000 in cash delivered through dead drops, another $800,000 held in a Moscow escrow account, at least 3 diamonds valued at around $54,000, multiple Rolex watches. Total, over $1.4 million. But here's what's strange. Unlike Ames, Hansen didn't live large. He and Bonnie resided in a split 2-level home on Talisman Drive in Vienna, purchased for about $150,000. The children shared bedrooms. The family drove older vehicles. Vacations were road trips to Florida. So where did the money go? The voyeur and his friend, Jack Hochschauer and Robert Hansen, had been friends since high school in Chicago. Hochschauer was best man at Hansen's wedding. He was godfather to all 6 of their children. A retired army officer who had done some intelligence work himself, he was Robert's closest, perhaps only real friend. And Robert Hansen used that friendship for something deeply disturbing. It started in the late 1960s when Hochschauer was in the army, stationed in Vietnam. Hansen took nude photographs of Bonnie and mailed them to his friend overseas, without her knowledge or consent. Years later, it escalated. Hansen hid a miniature video camera in his bedroom and filmed himself having sex with Bonnie. Then he invited Hochschauer over, and together the 2 men watched the tape in the family den after church, with Bonnie unaware, somewhere else in the house. Then it escalated further. Hansen installed a closed-circuit television system, running a hidden camera in the master bedroom to a monitor in the guest bedroom. When Hochschauer visited, he could watch the Hansens having sex in real time. Sometimes, Hansen simply invited Hochschauer to watch them through the bedroom window. Bonnie never knew. Not about the photographs sent to Vietnam, not about the video camera, not about the closed-circuit television. not about her husband's best friend watching her most intimate moments. Hansen also posted explicit stories about his sex life with Bonnie on an internet news group called alt.sex.stories, using his real name. According to investigators, he provided information sufficient for those who knew him to recognize the couple. In one post from March 1999, Hansen explained how he had purchased mini surveillance cameras specifically so his friend could watch him having sex with his wife. This was the same man who attended daily mass at 6:30 in the morning, the same man who marched in pro-life rallies, the same man who lectured colleagues about the importance of church attendance and denouncing the Russians as godless. Psychiatrist Dr. David Charney, who'd spent nearly 100 hours interviewing Hansen, concluded he was the most compartmentalized person I'd ever met, capable of being a remarkably different person in terms of outlook, values, and behavior at different times and circumstances, to the point of making me wonder whether he should be diagnosed with multiple personality disorder. Charney ultimately decided the diagnosis didn't fit, but noted if there were a compartmentalization measure, Hansen would be a 10 out of 10 point scale. The stripper. In the summer of 1990, Robert Hansen walked into a strip club called Joanna's 1819 Club, located just minutes from FBI headquarters in Washington. There, he saw a woman named Priscilla Sue Gailey. She was 33 years old, an exotic dancer. Hansen handed her a note that read, "I had never expected to see such grace and beauty in a strip club." What followed was an 18-month relationship, during which Hansen spent approximately $80,000 on Gailey. He bought her a Mercedes-Benz, he gave her diamonds and jewels, he set her up with an American Express card, he paid for her dental work, he brought her on an FBI inspection trip to Hong Kong, he took her to Quantico, the FBI training academy. When she asked where the money came from, he said he'd received a large inheritance from his mother. Gailey later claimed that although she offered to have sex with Hansen, he declined, saying he was trying to convert her to Catholicism. But Jack Hochstauer told investigators that Hansen had admitted to having bad sex with her, and Gailey herself eventually came to believe that Hansen had been grooming her, preparing her to help with his espionage, perhaps to assist with dead drops and pickups. When Gailey became addicted to crack cocaine and called Hansen for help, his response was chilling. Priscilla had made her bed, and now she had to lay in it. He vanished from her life completely. The man who had spent $80,000 on her, money that came from selling his country's secrets, simply walked away. Meanwhile, his 6 children were attending private Catholic schools, his wife was teaching theology at an Opus Dei institution, and every morning at 6:30, Robert Hansen knelt before the altar and received communion. Part 5. Hunting himself. 20 years of missed opportunities. The FBI's failure to catch Robert Hansen for 2 decades represents one of the most comprehensive institutional failures in American law enforcement history. The Department of Justice Office of Inspector General later concluded that he evaded detection not because he was a master spy who was extraordinarily clever and crafty, but because of long-standing systemic problems in the FBI's counterintelligence program and a deeply flawed internal security program. The missed opportunities are staggering. 1980, Bonnie discovered his spying. He confessed to a priest instead of authorities. Nothing happened. 1990, Hansen's brother-in-law, Mark Walk, himself an FBI agent, reported the suspicious cash to his supervisor. Walk knew the FBI was hunting for a mole. He knew about the pile of money on the dresser. He knew that Hansen had once talked about retiring in Poland. He told his supervisor everything. The supervisor readily dismissed the concerns. No investigation followed. Hansen continued spying for 11 more years. 1992, Hansen hacked a colleague's computer and downloaded classified documents. When confronted, he claimed he was testing security. The explanation was accepted at face value. 1993, Hansen physically approached a GRU officer in the Russian embassy parking garage. He identified himself as Ramon Garcia and a disaffected FBI agent. The Russians were so alarmed, they filed a protest with the US government. An FBI investigation was opened. It did not advance. And here's perhaps the most damning fact of all. In 25 years as an FBI agent with access to the most sensitive counterintelligence information in the entire of the United States, Robert Hanssen was never polygraphed. Not once. He received exactly one background re-investigation in 1996, 20 years after joining the Bureau. Senator Charles Grassley summarized it bluntly. There's no excuse for Robert Hanssen's treason, but there's also no excuse for the FBI's failure to take seriously his obvious and repeated security violations. The mole hunt. In 1987, with American assets dying in Moscow and intelligence programs collapsing, the FBI launched a mole hunt. They needed to find whoever was betraying them from within. The agent they assigned to lead the investigation? Robert Hanssen. He was searching for himself. And what did he do with this assignment? He steered the investigation away from his own activities. He gave the entire penetration study, including a list of all Soviets who had contacted the FBI about moles, to the KGB. The investigation was closed without making any arrests. When Aldrich Ames was finally arrested in February 1994, the FBI believed they had found their man. Ames had been responsible for the deaths of at least 10 American assets. The mole hunt appeared to be concluded. But two cases remained unexplained. The compromise of the Felix Bloch investigation in 1989, when the KGB was somehow warned about FBI surveillance, and the Embassy Tunnel, a joint FBI-NSA project costing several $100 million to dig a listening tunnel beneath the Soviet embassy. Hanssen had sold that for $55,000. The FBI never received any useful intelligence from the operation. Ames couldn't have been responsible for either case. He was stationed in Rome during both events, but the FBI couldn't bring themselves to believe one of their own might be a traitor. Instead, they focused on an innocent man, Brian Kelly, a CIA officer who happened to live on the same street as Hanssen. For years, Kelly was surveilled, interrogated, and placed on administrative leave. The FBI even produced a 70-page report recommending espionage charges against him. Meanwhile, the real traitor continued to work. The $7 million file. The breakthrough came not through good detective work, but through the oldest currency in espionage: money. The FBI ran a program called Backlaw to pay former Russian intelligence officers for information. In 2000, counterintelligence officer Michael Rockford obtained a KGB file from a source identified as Alexander Shcherbakov, a former officer who had thoughtfully removed the file as insurance against a rainy day. The price tag? $7 million. The file on Agent B contained everything the FBI needed. An audio recording from July 21st, 1986, a phone conversation between B and KGB officer Alexander Fefilov. Partial fingerprints recovered from a plastic trash bag B had used to wrap documents. Documentary evidence, materials he had passed to the Soviets. And a distinctive quote, General George S. Patton's famous speech about purple-pissing Japanese. FBI agent Michael Waguspak listened to the tape. The voice was familiar, but he couldn't place it. FBI analyst Bob King remembered something. Hanssen used that same Patton quote. Waguspak listened again. He recognized the voice. The fingerprints confirmed it. After 15 years of searching, after wrongly targeting an innocent man, after millions of dollars and countless hours, the mole had a name. Part 6. The Sting. The FBI could have arrested Hanssen immediately. They had the file, the fingerprints, the voice recording, but they wanted more. They wanted to catch him in the act, threatening the death penalty to ensure his full cooperation. FBI Director Louis III personally led the investigation, which eventually involved approximately 300 personnel. In December 2000, Assistant Director Neil Gallagher called Hanssen with a bogus promotion. Special assistant for a technology project, a 2-year service extension, and evaluation to the senior executive service. It was everything Hanssen had wanted, the recognition he felt he deserved but never received. Obviously, he accepted. His new office at FBI headquarters was secretly outfitted with surveillance cameras and microphones. Every word he spoke, every file he accessed, every phone call he made, all monitored. But the FBI needed someone closer, someone inside his daily routine. They chose Eric O'Neill, O'Neill was 27 years old, Catholic, critical for gaining Hansen's trust, and a member of the FBI's Special Surveillance Group. His assignment? Pose as Hansen's new assistant, learn his habits, find evidence. His codename was Werewolf. Hansen's codename within the investigation was Grey Day. O'Neill later described his first day with Hansen. He barely spoke to me at first, and he insisted I call him boss or sir. Hansen taught him what he called Hansen's Law. The spy is where he has access to the information that he knows he can use to do the most damage and get the most money. He was describing himself, the Palm Pilot. The critical moment came when O'Neill realized he needed to obtain Hansen's Palm 3 PDA, a handheld device that Hansen talked about more than his wife. It might contain evidence. It might contain everything. The FBI devised a plan. An assistant director challenged Hansen to a shooting competition with a $20 bet. Hansen, who collected guns and fancied himself a marksman, well, he couldn't resist. The moment Hansen left for the range, O'Neill grabbed the device and sprinted 3 flights of stairs to the FBI tech team. The download was agonizingly slow. Hansen had encrypted the data. Minutes passed. The team worked frantically. Then O'Neill's pager buzzed. Hansen was returning early. The tech team thrust the device back into O'Neill's hand with one word: run. O'Neill raced back to the office. He had to return the Palm Pilot to Hansen's bag, but he couldn't remember which pocket he'd taken it from. The bag had 4 pockets for 3 devices. He guessed, replaced it, and waited. Hansen burst in, furious, accusing O'Neill of entering his office without permission. O'Neill laughed it off, played the dumb clerk, and Hansen left fuming, apparently without detecting the tampering. The Palm Pilot contained copies of documents Hansen had given to the Russians. It contained the date of his next scheduled drop. It contained the location. O'Neill later wrote, "It was the lone smoking gun that let us win the case." The Sleeping Tiger. By February 2001, Hansen sensed danger. After 22 years of paranoid caution, his instincts were screaming. He believed he heard noises on his car radio indicating surveillance. He felt watched. In his final letter to his Russian handlers, intercepted by the FBI, he wrote, "Something has aroused the sleeping tiger." And yet, on Sunday, February 18th, 2001, he proceeded anyway. Maybe he couldn't stop. Maybe the game was all that made him feel alive. Maybe after decades of playing God with other people's lives, he simply couldn't imagine that the world would ever catch up with him. At approximately 8 p.m, he drove to Folkestone Park, placed the vertical stripe of white tape on the entrance sign, walked to the footbridge, and taped a garbage bag full of classified documents to its underside. Then the FBI closed in. What took you so long? Nearby agents found a bag containing $50,000 in cash, his payment from the Russians, which he would never collect. Eric O'Neill's final reflection? You eyed me from behind your desk, took one of your countless ballpoint pens, clicked it relentlessly, and sized me up as if I were just another inferior who'd never measure up. A worthless clerk, you called me. You had no idea, of course, that I was there to catch you. Part 7. Judgment. The Deal. Robert Hansen faced the death penalty. The evidence was overwhelming. The file, the fingerprints, the voice recording, the Palm Pilot, the arrest at the dead drop site with classified materials in hand. On June 14th, 2001, he secretly agreed to a plea deal that would spare his life. In exchange for avoiding execution, he would submit to over 200 hours of debriefing by the FBI, CIA, and other intelligence agencies, waive attorney-client and priest-penitent privileges, reveal the full scope of his espionage activities, submit to polygraph examination and psychological analysis, and in return, life imprisonment without parole. Bonnie would receive 55% of his FBI pension, approximately $39,000 to $400,000 a year. The family would keep their home and vehicles. All money received from Moscow would be forfeited. On July 6, 2001, Hansen pleaded guilty to 15 counts of espionage and conspiracy. Sentencing. May 10, 2002, the federal courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia. Robert Hansen stood before U.S. District Chief Judge Claude M. Hilton and read a prepared statement. I apologize for my behavior. I am shamed by it. I have betrayed the trust of so many. I opened the door for calumny against my totally innocent wife and children. I've hurt so many deeply. For all this, I stand ready to accept the sentence of this court. Assistant US Attorney Randy Bellows delivered the prosecution's assessment. Robert Hanssen broke every major promise he ever made to the FBI, the American government, and the American people. He took the nation's most critical secrets and used them as personal merchandise. He was in essence the cruelest kind of thief. A traitor in our midst with no line that he would not cross. FBI Director Louis Freeh called it the most traitorous action imaginable against a country governed by the rule of law. Judge Hilton imposed 15 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. The Alcatraz of the Rockies. On July 17, 2002, Robert Hanssen was transferred to the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado, known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies. It is the highest security federal prison in America, housing inmates deemed too dangerous or too high profile for any other facility. For nearly 21 years, Hanssen lived in a 7 by 12 foot cell, confined for 23 hours a day. 1 hour of recreation in a cage outdoors. Meals delivered through a slot in his door. Minimal human contact. His neighbors in this concrete isolation included Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, Ramzi Youssef, mastermind of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, Zacharias Musaev, the 20th hijacker of 9/11, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, the Boston Marathon bomber. Bonnie visited regularly. The children visited. All meetings were monitored. Hanssen was allowed to watch a dramatization of his own life, Master Spy, the Robert Hanssen story, starring William Hurt. He became so angry at the betrayal that he turned it off. Closing. The end of all things. June 5th, 2023, approximately 6:55 in the morning, Robert Philip Hanssen was found unresponsive in his cell. Staff initiated life-saving measures. He was pronounced dead by emergency medical services. The autopsy confirmed the cause: metastatic colon adenocarcinoma, colon cancer that had spread throughout his body. He was 79 years old. He had spent 22 years in solitary confinement, almost exactly the same length of time he had spent as a spy. Eric O'Neill reflected. Robert Hanssen died June 5th, 2023, in his tiny cell. He was 57 when he was arrested and 79 when he died. That 22 years spent alone in a 7 by 12 foot cell, perhaps atoning for his crimes, perhaps raging against his downfall, I'll never know. The FBI website still describes Robert Hanssen as the most damaging spy in Bureau history. His case forced reforms that had been resisted for decades. Mandatory polygraphs, financial disclosure, improved computer security, a cultural shift from trust-based to verification-based security. But the damage was done. Agents executed. Billion-dollar programs compromised. America's nuclear war plans in enemy hands. And a wound to institutional trust that has never fully healed. Dr. David Charney's final assessment: when somebody feels like a failure internally, there are many ways to manage that. Robert Hanssen blamed the FBI and turned to the US intelligence community's #1 enemy at that time, the KGB. Former CIA psychologist Gerald Post saw deeper. There's a huge sense of superiority that comes through clearly here. How immensely clever I am. The Soviets don't know who I am. The FBI doesn't have the vaguest idea of what I'm doing. It's a game of solitaire that he's playing. Hanssen thought himself as James Bond. The FBI thought of him as a librarian. The gap between those perceptions and the rage it produced in a man already damaged by decades of his father's cruelty may explain more than any single motivation ever could. He was the man who filmed his own wife and let his best friend watch. The man who spent $80,000 on a stripper and then abandoned her when she needed help. The man who betrayed agents who trusted America and watched them get bullets in the back of their heads. The man who sold his country's nuclear war survival plans to the enemy. And every single morning for decades, he knelt before an altar and received communion. He died alone in a concrete cell, having outlived the Cold War, the Soviet Union, and most of the people he betrayed. Whether those 22 years of isolation brought atonement or only fury, no one will ever know. What we do know is this. Some people build walls between the different parts of themselves so thick they become different people entirely. Robert Hanssen was a devoted father, and a traitor, a devout Catholic and a voyeur, an FBI agent and a KGB spy. A man who believed he was the smartest person in any room and who died in a room barely bigger than a closet. In his last letter to the Russians, intercepted by the FBI before his arrest, he wrote something that captures the loneliness at the center of his compartmentalized life. I hate silence. I hate uncertainty. In the end, he got both.